Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. It's another episode of Hanselminutes. Today I'm chatting with Kris Nova. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. Scott, how are you doing?
I am living the dream. So people can't see unless if they're listening on the podcast, but you have a server rack behind you. And I really love talking about the cloud because there's a whole generation of people who have never actually touched a server. And I find that just a fascinating psychological thing. And you said a thing just before we started where you said, if I were to upload a picture to your social media site, which is Hachyderm, that one of the blinking lights would be mine. And that was such a visceral thing. It's so
Yeah.
much more interesting than the cloud.
Yeah. I have always had a deep infatuation with hardware and with computers in general. And I think one of the reasons I got into this whole biz in the first place was because of the whole like I can touch it, I can see it, I can feel it, and I can build it. Right. And I've always fancied myself a builder. And so I think like I've turned a career into working in the cloud and working at Azure and now working at GitHub. And I'm looking at it like I've kind of lost touch with like that inner child in me and just the ability to like go and just kind of sprawl out on the living room floor and build a computer and just see like where the dopamine takes me for the afternoon. And so I think that's one of the main reasons which I have the server rack here behind me.
I want to be a good person for the early in career, and I want to like be welcoming. I don't want to be a gatekeeper who keeps an early in career person. But I've always liked the like a real Jedi builds their own lightsaber. How can we balance ourselves as people who are maybe a little more senior in our careers and not say, well, you really should build the car from scratch before you learn to drive? Like, some people just want to use an Uber and some people want to build a kit car in their garage. I really want to encourage people to build their own racks, but it's not required to be a coder. So how do I balance that?
Well, I think it's not only is it not required to be a coder, but like not everyone can afford a half server rack behind them, right? Like, and I think that one of the things that I've done is like I don't have kids. I've been working in the industry for 10 years. I've saved up money, and I've made the decision to go and invest into like my little hobby behind me here, and it's paid off from time to time. But I definitely don't want to, like you said, be a gatekeeper, and I don't want to create the paradigm that you need to build a elaborate server rack and have this like crazy set of hardware behind you at your house with this very expensive internet connection in order for you to be successful, because you don't. This is something that I've decided to do almost as a way for me to keep my sanity during my day job. So I do think it's important to find balance. And I also think that like there's something to be said about how do we unlock these types of experiences for people who are younger in the career? How do we get $50,000 worth of hardware in front of someone who maybe just wants to be able to like kick the tires and tinker with it without the fear or risk of, taking down somebody's production service?
It'd be interesting to wheel it into a high school gym and say, here's our rack and what we're going to be working on today.
Right. Welcome to high school. We'll take all of your public keys and everybody get on the wireless network in the gym.
Well, I don't have a rack of that sophistication, but I do have 6 Raspberry Pis in a stack
dun, dun, dun.
running Kubernetes, which I found to be the cheapest way for me to spend like $150 and learn Kubernetes. So there is a balance, right? We could potentially do it with a stack of Pis.
Yeah. Okay. I have to ask about your Raspberry Pis now. So,
okay.
How did you set up Kubernetes on those Raspberry Pis of yours, Scott?
So Alex Ellis has a script, and he has 2 different versions of this. We did this a couple of years ago. We did it by setting up SD cards and then basically using Noobs, the Raspberry Pi thing, and then we set up one of them, and then we had to run a script to change the name of each individual Pi, load them all on to the same Wi-Fi to bootstrap them, and then we SSH'd manually into each one. This thing that I'm holding up here is a single power source, and then I would have to run them all into this other separate router. And I used it for demos, but then a thing came out, and I don't know how to pronounce it. It's not K8S, it's K3S.
I say K3S, or I've heard K3s.
K3s?
K3s?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm familiar with the project. It's I think it's a single Go binary, and
right.
it just runs like a Kubernetes compliant layer of software. I am very much in favor of this posture in general.
So Alex Ellis, who got me started on this, made a thing called Ketchup, which is K3S up.
Oh gosh. Oh wow.
No,
Okay.
it's the worst. I know. So it's basically a utility that goes from 0 to kube config with any system. So as long as you have SSH access, you run his Ketchup binary, and he sets you all up. So then you can bootstrap this. So he's got it down from like a weekend to a couple of hours. And if you've got a bunch of Raspberry Pis, these are actually Pi 3Bs.
Oh,
So they're not.
those are the ones with four gigabytes of memory. Those are like real
Yeah.
computers, and that's
Yeah,
you're holding
yeah.
a real computer there.
Oh yeah, it's a real computer, and this is a great way to teach people like the visceral feeling of like this is a machine. Because when I'm explaining how this storage works, I love your example. I can upload an image and a light will blink. But if you have spinning Rust, you could put your hand on the hard drive and feel it go.
Yeah.
And that's so cool.
One of the things that we did, so we just got this new house in Seattle, and it was the rack was one kind of gift I got to myself, was like I want to build myself a place where I can go and kind of be a mad scientist in a little confined safety here. The second thing I got was I don't know if you like music at all, but I bought a new tube receiver with analog warm vacuum tubes that sit in the top, and like you have to like turn it on, and it literally it warms up, and it takes like a good 2 minutes before it's like really up to temperature, and it like sounds really good, and like you put the record on the record player. And anyway, I found a new love for just like isolating 15 minutes of my day and going and listening to a side of a record through vacuum tubes, and it's just been great.
That is a very deliberate, intentional practice to do that. As opposed to just saying, "Hey, AI in the cloud, play this track for me."
So we totally have the hey. I don't want to say it because it'll come on.
It's staring at me right here.
Yeah,
if I
exactly.
say her name, she's gonna do something.
But we have that, and actually, in the case of the upstairs record player, it's sitting right on the exact same console as the record player itself. And I will listen to the record player instead. And I think it's because it's more of like my ability to like focus on something and touch something. So like a good example of this is if I can cook dinner in like a half of an album, I know that's about 15 minutes worth of time. And so I have to time myself, and it's like really friendly for my neurodivergence and my ADHD to be like, hey, I have 15 minutes to go accomplish this task, and then the record's going to stop playing and the needle's going to sit there and pop until I go touch it. And like that's my signal to like, hey, it's been 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's like a very chill Pomodoro.
Yeah.
You seem like the kind of person who would have a Nixie clock.
A Nixie clock?
Do you know what Nixie
clocks
are?
No, what's a Nixie clock?
Oh, okay. Well, now you're going to discover these and immediately want to buy one. Okay. So Nixie clocks are vacuum tube clocks. You have 6 of them in a row showing hours, minutes, and seconds. You see them in shows like Firefly or Mr. Robot, and it's meant to show that this person is kind of steampunk retro. And the Nixie tubes are vintage, and there's only like 2 companies that make them. So imagine a 2x4 board with these vacuum tubes, and then inside the vacuum tube are the not LCDs, but imagine like an LCD, but it's actually like little tiny neons all overlaid on top of each other, like little neon deals, and it tells the time. Nixie clocks are crazy, and they're about $300, and they're completely excessive and awful and wonderful, and they're just unbelievable. Oh, actually, people can't see, but I can probably do this. There you go. That's a Nixie clock.
Yeah, that looks very similar to our record player upstairs. And I think the moment my partner Quintessence hears Firefly and analog something and nerdy timekeeping,
this Christmas is now a Nixie clock.
Yeah, this conversation is over. This decision has been made.
Okay, so here we are talking about Nixie clocks, and we're talking about record players and vacuum tubes. These are all examples of doing things the hard way. Why is doing things the hard way helping your neurospiciness, helping you chill?
I'll be honest, right? And like when I look at what I do in a given day, between my day job at GitHub and the open source projects I maintain, and dealing with people in Discord and talking with people in GitHub and talking with people on Zoom and even podcasts like this and social media and shopping and it's all very quick. It's all very fast paced. It's all very immediate return on investment on the dopamine scale. I think that like when I get hands on with a piece of technology that's a little simpler, it brings me back to that like very simple machine, basic science like way of thinking, and it just kind of slows me down. And I noticed that as I'm getting older, like my blood pressure, my ability to just chill and just try to like enjoy something again for the sake of enjoying it and find that moment of tranquility or zen is very, very important to me. And I actually
Hmm.
got to the point where I'm scheduling time just for this, just because like I realized that like my overall well-being and my mental health is so deterministic based off of how much of this zen time I get in a given day.
I uh, I had my 30-year high school reunion a while back, and then we all got together at this local bagel shop, and a bunch of them were commenting how relaxed I was, and the reason that they were saying that is because I was pretty, I was wound pretty tight, and they asked me that, and I was just like, I took a moment, and I just like was present for just a second, and I said, I've really chilled out. Like I'm on like the third or fourth version of myself. This version of Sky is super chill.
Scott 4.0.
Oh yeah, totally. And then when you talk about um, simpler times, I'm going to reach down again. This has really brought me a lot of joy. I've been building this Commodore 64. It's an FPGA reimplementation of a Commodore 64 in a clear acrylic case. And I recently figured out how to get it on the network, and then I can telnet into an Azure VM from this in 40 characters. And it's totally ridiculous. Like, why do I need a 6502 microprocessor like brought into Azure? Because it's fun. And I'm doing all these dumb things, but they bring me so much chill joy.
That's the key word there. That you said the magic word, which is joy. And like I have a whole chapter in my book dedicated to this, and I like even take like a really nerdy scientific approach to it, just because I feel like that will resonate with so many folks. I feel like we've all gotten ourselves in this big hurry, and we've all lost touch with like the fact that like it can just be fun, just like full stop. Like it is okay to do things a little bit wonky or a little bit absurd just because it makes you smile. And one of the things that I started doing, I got a really good piece of advice earlier this year, which was count your smiles. Like if you have observability on anything in your life, it's how often are you smiling and how much fun are you having each day? How many mornings do you wake up with a grin on your face? And like I realized that there was a lot of things that I was doing in my life and a lot of time I was investing in that just wasn't contributing to that. In fact, like at the end of the day, I didn't really have much to show for it, and it was actively contributing to my stress, and I carried that with me, and it was difficult, right?
Mm-hmm. And you talk about this in your book, Hacking Capitalism, which you can get if you're a Kindle Unlimited person, or you can buy in hardcover. There's an EPUB as well, hackingcapitalism.io. Now, that sounds like another thing that you added to your list that you probably didn't need to. You're just sitting around having thoughts, and you're like, I need to write another book.
So can I just share like the anecdote on the book? I haven't told anybody this before. So the whole thing started was I had decided to write a book on distributed operating systems. And this thesis that I was working on has later turned into a new open source project of mine called Aura, or Aure, if you want to pronounce it with the Icelandic accent. And as I started to write this very technical book, I was considering making it like another O'Reilly book, for instance. I caught myself writing the first sort of preface and the first chapter and the foreword and everything. And there was so much I needed to cover just to even be able to type the first sentence of the technical book as far as context setting occurred, that initial like predecessor to my book later turned into Hacking Capitalism. And it was just the prerequisite before I could even start working on a technical book again.
That reminds me of when I was talking to Charles Petzold about his book Code, where he starts out at the beginning of the book with a light bulb. And by the end of the book, you've implemented your own like x86 processor. And he just needed to get it out. Like it was in him. And it's like, okay, here's all the context. Here's the last 100 years of computing and electricity and all this stuff. We can't even talk about coding until we do this and build the base of the of the pyramid. So it sounds like you put out a book, which is like, here's my philosophy on which all of my other things that I do are stacked on top of.
Exactly right. Like to be very specific about it, I was looking at like Kubernetes and operating systems and Linux in general. And like I'm having all these thoughts about like, well, Linux made the assumption that a single user would sit in front of a single terminal, right? Built on Unix, and that had been around for decades. And Kubernetes came around and said, let's try to like start to do some sort of distributed computing. And we kind of took a few successful patterns of distributed systems and applied them to Kube. And I'm looking at the whole thing from a user perspective, and I'm like, I just don't know if we've actually built like the distributed Linux I think the industry is looking for, right? Like I still think there's opportunity for innovation here, and there's opportunity for us to kind of work backwards from some of the successes that we've seen in these Kubernetes-like systems. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I can't even explain any of this until I first explain why people want to run so much junk in the cloud anyway. And in order for me to do that, I have to go down this whole diatribe of like, the economy and enterprise scale and customer service relationships. And it was just all of this other stuff that I was like, I couldn't find any language for it. I couldn't find a single piece of literature out there that just structured things so that we could talk about it objectively. And that's how hacking capitalism came to be.
There's so much context, especially historical context, that I struggle with when I'm teaching software and systems to like younger people like under 30, that we have such a privilege to be a certain age, to have seen it happen. I'm going to be giving a talk tomorrow, and I'm going to bring the Commodore 64 with me. And I've got all this privilege of like being around when bulletin boards were a thing and FidoNet nodes. And like what you're doing with a rack running Mastodon behind you is kind of like, 30 years ago, I was running a FidoNet node on an OS2 system in my parents' garage with a digiboard, and we were just doing the best we can to figure it out. And I want more people to have experiences like that, to feel what that feels like, so that they might take that energy into whatever they decide to do with their lives in computing. But I don't also want to be overly nostalgic and just be like old man who shakes fist at cloud. So I'm trying to find that balance.
Two things come to mind when you say that. The first one, I'll just shout them out at a high level. The first one is skateboarding. And the second one is, I do believe that I've gotten so old that I've gone full circle on it. And I feel like I see this both in computing and in like my music taste and like the clothes that I wear. Like I've just never left the 90s. And now the 90s are cool again. And so I just keep wearing red plaid.
You're just going to keep waiting until it comes back.
Putting on my Third Eye Blind records. Like, yeah, this is great. I've never stopped. And now we're back again. And it's cool. But like when I say skateboarding, one of the things that skateboarding taught me as a kiddo was like how to do dangerous things cautiously. Right? Like skateboarding is stupid, right? It's like mountain climbing. Like it's just kind of absurd.
You're asking for it.
Yeah. But like people keep doing it, and it's a great sport, and it's, can be good for the whole family. And I look at it like, but like, what did it teach me? It taught me how to like tiptoe into danger. And how to like do that, like sort of like methodically, and to calculate risks and to take risks like as needed, and like how to get hurt and recover and learn from that. And I look at the internet the same way, right? Like I don't think I would have been nearly as comfortable just like firing up a piece of hardware at the house, exposing my public IP to the internet, turning on some unknown software and saying, here you go, internet, have fun. Sign up for an account. What's the worst that can happen? And I think the reason I'm comfortable doing that is because I've spent 30 years, trying to learn how to do dangerous things cautiously, and how to like recover from them, and, how to observe them and detect when there's like some sort of really bad danger ahead.
And the ability, or the access to be able to do that and fail and pick yourself up and keep going is something that I think more people deserve. Like I want people to have the psychological safety and the ability to like come to work, make mistakes, learn from them. Because I feel like what I have to offer is 30 years of mistakes, but I had the freedom to make them. So it's awesome that you've got it to a place where you feel that you can do that. You can, helmet or no helmet, get on the skateboard and be okay. And I hope more people have that feeling.
Yeah. I that's one of the things I try to deliberately do as a senior IC working at like, Microsoft and GitHub, is just try to make it safe and just try to provide psychological safety for younger folks in their career, to say like, we're all scientists here, right? Like there's a big difference between just goofing off and science, and that's writing things down. And
Mhm.
so like as long as we're formulating hypotheses and we're like measuring them and taking good observations, like go for it. Let's have fun. Like we're
Yeah,
all
yeah.
here to learn. Like nobody's built the internet before. This is our right. Like this is our first time.
There was an older gentleman on within my company who had chatted me earlier today because he had heard that term psychological safety before, and he didn't know what that word meant. He didn't understand what that meant. He's like, "Is it just like being squishy? Like don't be a jerk?" And I was like, "No, it's like if you ask me a question, this is the example I gave him earlier today. I said, if you said, 'Hey, how do I FTP this?' I might think to myself without saying it, I might think, you should know that. And then immediately flip the bozo bit on you. And I'd
Mm-hmm.
be like, yeah, guy's a bozo. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And then it's always gonna be in the back of my mind that you don't know how to do that. And then like you're gonna wonder, like, is it on my annual report? Is it gonna affect my job? Am I gonna get fired? Like, does this boss think I'm an idiot? But that's as much on me to like make you feel like there's a threat that I'm going to flip the bozo bit on you just because you asked a question. So if I can let you know that there are no dumb questions, I'm not going to flip the bozo bit on you. That is what psychological safety means. It's more than just don't be a jerk.
Yeah. It's the two words that come to mind for me: judgment,
Mm.
and I would say that the second word is safety. Well, I guess that kind of comes with psychological safety, but like the ability to like cast this like it's okay to make mistakes. um but it's very easy, especially in your career, when you are this coupled to revenue streams and corporate needs and product goals and making money, and everything's about profit, 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 profit all the time. It's very easy for you to like make a mistake, or to possibly say something, or for somebody to perceive you the wrong way, and then that turns into, like you said, the bozo bit. And I think that like anything you can do to create like the safe blanket of like, hey, it's okay, we're in a safe space right now, and like anything you say is not going to like influence my ability to look at you and measure you based off of the quality of the character and the work you perform.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I feel like getting back to like Kubernetes, I feel like that sometimes like I'm going to ask some question that's going to like change someone's perception of me, and they'll be like, you don't know how that thing works? But I can't know everything, so I'm going to assume I'm going to not know some stuff. And if I ask a dumb question, I ask a dumb question. But at least I feel like I can,
Yeah.
as opposed to keeping my mouth shut and then worrying that I'll. And then you get imposter syndrome because you
Oh,
never
sure.
asked, which is a whole thing.
Yeah, that's a whole
I could
thing.
I could write a book on that. So November 3rd of 2022, you had about 700 of your close friends hanging out on the rack behind you, and then a couple weeks later, you had 30,000 people on the rack behind you. At any point, you could have simply shut it down and said no. Why did you keep going and building the community on the Mastodon server that you have?
The reason that I made the decision not to shut anything down is the same reason that I would always welcome somebody into my home. Right. I think that like taking a step back from the Mastodon numbers, like if we examine the reason why the numbers were the way they were, most folks were, for lack of a better term, Twitter refugees. Right. And I've spent the past 5 years talking to my therapist about unpacking my relationship with, social media, and how dependent upon it I am, as far as like my own perception of myself and my self-esteem. And there was a common theme, which was my relationship with Twitter. And I think that like I often viewed Twitter as like my life character's like status bar in an RPG, right? Like my Twitter followers, and how many people I had, and did I achieve the check mark? Like did I get the secret master sword at the end of the Zelda game, or like whatever? That was kind of how I looked at Twitter. And I think that when I'm looking at Mastodon, I'm realizing that people are having to like break up with some like pretty substantial parts of themselves, and they're having to like move past some like really big parts of what they likely latched on to their self identity with. And I didn't have it in me to say no. I just didn't want to say like, no, you can't come here, or like I won't do what it takes to like, I already know how to operate this, I already know how to build the software and manage it, and we're already looking at like forming a legal entity behind it. I can't just turn people away just because like our servers aren't keeping up or something like that.
Mm-hmm. But the server that you were running on, just like, I mean, this is an awkward analogy, but like I have a Synology that I'm very proud of,
Sure.
that has 72 gigs of 72 terabytes of storage rather, of like every video and every photograph and everything since the kids were born. But you know, it barely runs a Pi hole. You just happen to have your home lab. Did you start throwing hardware at the problem? Did you already have the hardware? This is a 2 or 3 week period where you were putting down, order of magnitude numbers.
Yeah. So I think it started as like there's a server in the rack behind me still online named Alice, and she's kind of legendary in my Twitch community and like the folks that I hang out with on Discord. We've hacked into Kubernetes clusters, and we've written eBPF rootkits, and like we've done some pretty wild stuff on that server over the past few years, and she's been along for the ride. Like there was a time where I dropped her on Market Street in downtown San Francisco and like popped her in the rack and she was fine. And so that was, on a whim during the day. Like we decided to set up a Mastodon server in April, and it was right when all the news was coming out around Twitter, and that became our Postgres database, right? And I had other things in that Postgres database as well. I was running a Metasploit thing there, and like there was a lot that was being stored in that database, and people kept joining. And like any large production operation, once it's online, the problem isn't like understanding what to do next. The problem is like actually getting things into a place where you're ready to cut over without taking any downtime. So like the problem very quickly turned into, we have a production service and people keep putting more and more data in the rack behind me. And until we get the rack behind me stable, we really can't move it out into anywhere else without like taking, in some cases, 2 or 3 days worth of downtime. So I do think that, as it kind of unexpectedly grew, there was definitely a time where like I have 3 other servers down here that we call Yakko, Wacko, and Dot, where I was just like ripping the plastic off of them. We had just moved here and just like popping them into the rack as quick as I can. Like
you just had those already? You had the Animaniacs just available?
Yes. So one of the things that we've been working on is prototyping like a Kubernetes-like system within our new tool called Aura. And the whole point was to build like a 4-node cluster and try to like get to a point where we could move data around and try to make the 4 nodes sort of act as one. And those were like on standby in the garage, ready to go, and like unboxed them, threw them in the rack, and just got them online. But like this is used hardware that just got off of a moving truck, right?
These are Dell Power Edges that you've been collecting.
Right. It's definitely not the type of, hardware that, this stuff's 10 years old, but it's definitely not the type of hardware you would, see if you walked into a data center today.
Yeah. Okay. So you happen to have some extra devices in the garage. You're putting all this together. You're staying up late. You also start building a team of friends to help to put this together. But is the plan to always run it on a half rack behind you, or have you moved to the cloud? And in what's the relationship between running it in the cloud and running it locally?
So the big problem we have right now is like we need a lot of compute, and we need to keep our egress traffic very high. So we made the decision to move to Hetzner, which is like a co-location combination. Like they do some VMs, but they also do like what they call auction servers, where you get like a bare metal server at an auction price. And the main driving force behind that has been the amount of egress traffic we have to do, which is why one of the reasons why the rack behind me wasn't keeping up. One day we did a terabyte of egress traffic alone. So for a normal home ISP, it's the inverse of what we actually need, right? This is my upload speed, as we're effectively serving content for our users, was limited, which caused the main incentive to move to Hetzner.
I am going to log into my Ubiquity environment here, which is where I run with my little sad half rack that's in the coat closet. And I think that all of my traffic is mostly Xbox updates.
Sure.
It's probably several terabytes of Xbox updates, but a terabyte out in a single day is just kind of unheard of. And do you have a commercial ISP, or it's not exactly Comcast?
So I don't want to share too much about the ISP,
of course,
but what I can tell you is that it's a small business ISP with a /29, and that it's advertised as a gigabit down and 200 megs up. Which,
wow,
remember, we're talking the inverse of that when we're serving. So 200 megs up from my house is 200 megs down to our clients.
So I would assume that 200 megs up has just been saturated this whole time. Wow. Okay. So then this feeling that one gets when they're on Hachyderm of waiting, is it CPU bound, or is it just waiting for the bits to get out of the house?
That is an interesting question. So I wrote a write-up on our community page that we just launched a few days ago that talks a lot about the problems we have. We saw cascading problems. And I think that as we started to observe the cascading problems, there were different parts of the system that would like naturally absorb more or less of the problems of the root cause. So we would see like the disks would get slow because we had bad disks, and because the disks would get slow, like the message queues that sat behind Mastodon would fill up because they're waiting to write images and read images off the disks, and then those would fill up, and then they would consume a lot of memory, and then our memory would fill up, and then it would trickle downstream, and we would see other resource impact. So now that we're relatively stable, I would say like you can set up Mastodon. It's pretty tricky, but you can set it up such that it's like really memory intensive or that it's really compute intensive. And there's like two good strategies that you can follow for either one.
Okay. And I have heard, I haven't dug into the code, but I understand that Mastodon is written largely in Ruby, and it uses Sidekick for a lot of, it spins off little queues, little jobs every time anything interesting happens. And I have heard from some people that it may not be the most efficient. I have this feeling like sometimes I'm just in somebody's for loop, and maybe there may be some order n problems there. Have you been spending time in the code, or have you been doing this from the outside?
Everything. I've familiarized myself with the Sidekick queues. I've taken them apart and rebuilt like a Mastodon Federation system on my local laptop on an airplane. I've looked at how the worker code base works, and I've operated the thing now with 30,000 users.
You're deep in it.
Unfortunately, I have learned a lot over the past 30 days. I think the thing that I would take away would be like, we've learned a lot about how to schedule work with tools like Kubernetes over the past couple of years. I look at some of the paradigms that are in place with like how Mastodon and Sidekick are set up, and I'm realizing that there's actually a scheduling opportunity here. So like if you start a worker queue, it's very arbitrary, right? Like what is this specific queue going to actually do, and when is it going to do what it's supposed to do is a little unknown. And there's a good chance that like some of them might overlap, or there might be these unnecessary waiting periods in between where one queue kicks off to process and another one kicks off. And so we're kind of back into this like old cron job mentality of like, every day at 2:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, like is like, that's just when the system gets busy, because that's just when all the traffic happens to like overlay on top of each other. So we're not really in a situation where like we have any software that's balancing the amount of work that we do. And I think that even if you go and you read like how to tune a Sidekick worker, it's like, here's this concept of web concurrency, and then here's this concept of threads, and here's DB pool. And you want to make sure that your threads multiplied by your concurrency is less than your DB pool. And you have to go manually tweak all these values and then restart system services. And it's like this whole like heavy operational burden just to try to get like your compute somewhat stable over the course of a 24-hour period.
But forgive my ignorance, but there's the balancing and the scheduling of the work, but then there's also the weight of the individual unit of work itself. So, sending something off and saying, hey, unit of work, this is a Sidekick, go off and do that, is one thing. But if the work itself is inefficient, there's an opportunity there, isn't there?
I think so. I think like, not to pick on GitHub too much, but we see a lot of this at GitHub as well, which is a Ruby Rails shop as well, which is like Ruby Rails is very convenient from an application developer perspective, which means you inevitably end up making some like medium risky design choices as you start to couple your application to the data store. And so I think that when we look at Sidekick, like we don't really have a good way to separate reads from writes out of the database. It just kind of makes the assumption that like the Ruby code base is going to be available. We can read, we can write whenever we want. We don't really have to give any thought to like when we do our reads, when we do our writes, when we read from the media store, when we read from the database. It just kind of does it as needed at runtime. And I think that alone is probably the single part of the code base that has like the biggest opportunity for improvement. And that's why we see a lot of these like big, heavy, bulky systems come online, is because like there's just kind of like, oh, I need this value, let me just go get it, and then I have it here, and then I'll use it and then forget about it forever.
So I don't want to disparage any of our friends in the Ruby or Rails community, nor do I want to disparage any of the folks that are working so hard on Mastodon. But it sounds like there's lots of opportunity for optimization as this new social media environment like takes on this new, it's not new, it's 10 years in, but like there's an opportunity for it to be optimized for the scale that it's being asked to perform at. I see in a number of ways.
I see this pattern in all types of technology, especially Kubernetes, which is like it takes a very successful piece of technology to just build it once and for all and kind of just like have it run at scale so that we can find the areas that we want to cherry pick and work backwards from. And I think that like looking at Kubernetes specifically, like let's look at all the things we're trying to do with sidecars. Like, yes, we can solve them with sidecars, but like maybe this, like it took building Kubernetes in the public for 7 years before we finally like unveiled the actual problem, which is like, how do we get infrastructure alongside somebody's application? I do think we see a lot of that with Mastodon as well, which is like it took a successful open source project to like span the breadth of the globe and have millions of users run it before we were able to say like, maybe social media is actually more of a queue exercise than it is a browser exercise or whatever.
Now, if I understand correctly, Mastodon, you could run it in a single Ubuntu VM, just all by itself in one little thing. I've seen people even run it on Raspberry Pis. Is it standard practice to run Mastodon within Kubernetes, or are you all at the forefront of that?
I have made the decision not to run Mastodon in Kubernetes at this time. And I think the main reason for that is because I want to understand what the application is doing. And because it does require so much manual tuning, I worry that like putting too much dynamic scheduling on top of an already fairly brittle system would just yet another layer of complexity for us. Mm-hmm. So there is a Helm chart in the Mastodon repo. I do know people who are running it in Kube and they are successful. So I do think that it's a completely viable path. I think my intention with Mastodon is more of like the long-term sustainable approach to like, if there are parts of the code base I want to explore, like investing in or rewriting it in a different language, I want to be very intimate with like how the thing by itself works without the extra layer of abstraction on top of it.
So I'm not meaning to use words to refer to myself or my situation, but I'm going to use it because I have my own anecdote here. When I migrated from one Mastodon instance over to yours, did I DDoS you? What happened? Because I saw queues go up, and you and I had some back and forth trying to figure out. But it didn't seem like, from a pure numbers perspective, bringing 20,000 people with me isn't a big deal. But did I kick off 20,000 jobs?
So this is fascinating. This is what had led me to create like a new instance of Hachyderm and try to move my followers over and move them back, and ultimately led to me really digging in deep into the activity pub protocol. So there is an HTTP like security negotiation that goes on between follower and follow-e servers. And for every follower, both servers have to agree that this person does in fact follow Scott Hanselman. Now, because everything is related to queues, you, as somebody who is moving your followers, you're at the mercy of everybody else's server's ability to renegotiate on their end as well. And so this is all built around HTTP signatures, which use like a private and public key paradigm. So I have to sign a message, send it to your server, you have to read it, do your work, and then sign it and send it back. And that negotiation has to happen for every single independent instance on the internet. So when you move your 20,000 followers over, there might be like, server in San Francisco that is highly optimized, highly tuned, has plenty of available resources, and all of those followers come over very quickly. And then there might be some other server that is like, somebody hasn't looked on it, it's somebody's sitting in somebody's closet, and that queue may not ever actually finish. And I think the reason we see that the follower migration, sometimes like people are saying that people are losing followers, it's not that you're losing a follower, it's just that something's wrong with that federated instance that's causing them not to negotiate and reperform that HTTP signature that you need. Whereas if I click the follow button, it does it right then and there in the browser, and we're not waiting on some queue to silently fail in the backend.
So when I go look at the Mastodon instance that I came from, there's still 850 people that are just over there. They're like orphaned. Are they stuck in a queue for the last several weeks, or do we kick the queue again, or will they eventually wake up and realize they haven't heard from me in a while?
I think what I would do if I was in your situation, I would go and I would look at the domain behind those followers and see if there's any data there I could correlate. Like, are they all from a specific instance, right? Like, are they all at the same domain? I would also
they're at Mastodon Online.
There you go. Right. So that's a signal that Mastodon Online has probably got some error in their error logs and they're not able to refederate and refollow you.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through here. It's qoto.org and Mastodon Online. They're all the same.
Yep. So if I was to log in from one of those users' perspectives, I can almost guarantee what the behavior would look like would be like they would come to your page and it would look like a follower request of all things. So think about this. So they're in a half negotiated state. So their server has said like, okay, we haven't acknowledged that this is the new Scott Hanselman, but the new Scott Hanselman server says that I should be following them. So it looks like they're waiting on Hachyderm on our server to actually like accept the request, when really it's just that the keys haven't been re-authenticated yet.
Interesting. So that sounds like something that I would send a note to the admins of Mastodon Online and they could give it a kick.
I think so.
Or are they?
This is where we're getting into the Mastodon code base now. The give it a kick is not as straightforward as you would like it
There's
to be.
not like an admin UI where they go retry. It's going to be someone running their own SQL query.
It's not a SQL query. And so there is like a retry function. It's just, it's not as one-to-one as you would think. There's like this like generic like worker function that like it does like 30 things. And hopefully one of those things are going to kick off the right, piece of code to exercise the follower negotiation. But there's not like a way, as far as I could tell, to actually go and say, re-audit all of my followers and go and make sure that Scott Hanselman specifically, we've renegotiated with his new thing.
It's such a tough thing though, because 20,000 followers is not a lot. And if I were Stephen Fry or somebody with 1 million, or George Takei, and I show up, George Takei could just show up in your living room tomorrow, and that would be dramatic. And he would end up with hundreds of thousands of orphans followers. And is that an architectural problem, or is that just the price we pay for federation?
I think it's a consequence of federation. I think that if I was to like make a suggestion to anybody with large followers, it would be like get on an instance where like they're aware of the problem, like Hachyderm, or in a better world, spin up your own instance, right? And there's a couple of service providers out there that will like run a Mastodon instance for you. But I think that like any influencer, and you would know this, right? Like your audience is like a big part of what makes you, and you have to take that seriously. And I'm in the same way with my Twitch audience. Taking the followers to a point where like you realize that you're investing in that relationship and that you want to take some ownership of it, I think is important.
I think you lost me at the part where I have to take any of this seriously.
Oh, gotcha.
Mostly my Twitter following is just animated GIFs of Neil Patrick Harris and Beyonce.
Sure.
Which is largely not awesome, but it's interesting. However, everyone takes their social media presence different levels of serious.
Well, I think I make the assumption that like people are doing this pragmatically and like deliberately. Like I work with a lot of folks on Twitch who are very much in the like I want to make a living out of being a social media influencer and stream full time. Like,
that's a good point.
There's a good contact of mine. Her name's Lana Lux, and she's a professional indie video game developer, and most of her revenue comes from her Twitch stream. And so like her followers, I mean, that's her salary. So like she definitely takes that seriously. And so, yeah.
No, that is a very good reminder. If I didn't have a W-2 and I didn't work for Big Co, which gets into hacking capitalism,
right?
Then that follower account matters deeply. When I think of them now as just an extended social friend group.
Right.
Interesting. Well, folks can check you out of course, on Hachyderm. But also, I would encourage folks to take a look at your blog, to take a look at the Hachyderm blog. There's a great blog post called "Leaving the Basement," where you go into the details of moving to the next level for Hachyderm. It's currently closed for new users, but it's going to open up again. Is that right?
It's open right now, and right now until we get to maybe 200,000 users or so. Like as far as I'm concerned, I have all the intention of keeping it open. So if it is closed, it's likely for some unrelated reason other than like we had to close it the other day when there was some DDoS threats that had like come our way. But I don't foresee any time in the future where we're going to close it for any extended period of time.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much. You're doing such a wonderful service for all of us that are part of the Great Migration. And I appreciate your work, not just in this space, but of course, all of your open source work as well. You're very well respected in the space, and I'm very happy to have had you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
This has been another episode of Hanselminutes, and we'll see you again next week.